Good evening and welcome to the Your Vote 2014 Forum for the candidates in Arizona's 2nd Congressional District. I'm Christopher Conover with Arizona Public Media. We'll spend the next hour with Democratic incumbent Ron Barber and Republican challenger Martha McSally. Mr. Barber, Ms. McSally, thanks so much for being here. Now, before we begin, here are the rules for tonight's discussion. Each candidate will get a 90-second opening statement and a 90-second closing statement. In between, I'll ask questions from a list prepared by the Arizona Public Media News staff and not seen by the candidates. Some questions were submitted via Twitter. You can continue sending questions during this evening's live forum using the hashtag CD2Questions. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to each question and to any follow-ups. I'll be enforcing the time limits. Now for opening statements, first, based on a drawing beforehand, Martha McSally.
Thanks, Christopher. I'm retired Air Force Colonel Martha McSally, and I'm running for Congress because I don't walk by a problem. And the problems facing our country and community are severe. More than ever, the failures in Washington, D.C. are hurting us here in Southern Arizona. Middle-class families are struggling in this economy. Our unemployment is at 9.2%, and it was just reported this week that Tucson has the highest number of jobs lost in the whole country. The A-10 is only funded through December 11th, 65 more days, impacting our national security and our local economy. Our border is not secure. We've got border ranchers and residents making difficult decisions to keep their families safe. And we've got ISIS and Islamic extremists around the world that are more powerful and dangerous than Al-Qaeda pre-9/11 because of the failed foreign and defense policy of this administration. Luckily, every 2 years we get to decide who we want to represent us in Congress, to fight for us, to address these issues and more. And this is like a job interview with the voters. And for a job interview, we bring to them our qualifications, our experience, and our record of getting things done. And for Mr. Barber here, this is a performance evaluation. He's been there almost 3 years and things are getting worse. We're in a crisis, and a crisis takes leadership that's going to do the right thing, have a vision, and be effective. I've been in situations like this before that take resolve and take courage. I've served, I've fought, I've led, and I've stood up for what's right, and I'm honored to serve you if I'm elected.
And now Mr. Barber's opening statement.
Well, first of all, Chris, thank you and Arizona Public Media for bringing us together. This is an opportunity for the people of Southern Arizona to see the two candidates side by side and to make a decision about what they represent, what policies they will carry into office, and whether or not they can be trusted and whether or not they know this community. I'm very honored and proud to have served now in Congress since June of 2012. And I look forward, hopefully, for the voters to say, he's done a good job, let's send him back. When I went to Congress, I said I was going to be an independent voice for Southern Arizona. And I'm proud of the record that we've had since I went to Congress. The National Journal, one of the most objective political magazines in the country, has determined that I'm the 4th most independent member of the House of Representatives. I have deep roots here. My family's here. My wife was born here. I met her on Davis Monthan Air Force Base when my dad brought us here when I was a teenager. My daughters and grandchildren are here. I love this community. This is our home. And this is where I intend to continue my public service in Congress if the voters send me back. Let me just close with this. Today is an historic day. Today, the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. courts declared that marriage equality was something that they would approve. It's about time, because anyone who loves someone else ought to be able to make the same commitment that I made to my wife 47 years ago. And I'm so proud that we were going to see that marriage equality become part of our culture across the country.
Thank you to both of you. I'm sure we're going to cover a number of the topics that you hit on in your opening statements. Mr. Barber, due to the draw, you get to answer the first question first. This is a rematch of the 2012 campaign. We were all here 2 years ago. What's the difference this time, and do you have a minute for that answer?
Well, the difference is that the voters of Southern Arizona know that I've been a member of Congress for almost 2.5 years. They elected me twice in 2012, and I'm very proud to serve, but they also know my record. I went to Congress saying that I would be an independent voice for the Southern Arizonans that I represent, and I have done that. I have stood up to the President and to my party anytime it was important to vote for a bill that made sense for people back home. I have never been a party line person, and I don't intend to be one in the future. People can rely on me to be trustworthy and honest about my positions and not flip-flop around on positions. People know who I am, and that's, I think, a very important part of this race. You know, in 2012, I was running with no really known record. Today I have one I'm very proud of. Bipartisanship is one of the most important elements that I think we need to bring to Congress, and I've worked hard to make sure that I reach across the aisle and make sure that people on both sides of the aisle work together to solve our problems and find common ground.
Ms. McSally, same question to you. What's different from 2012? And you have 1 minute.
Well, I stepped up to run without any political background, but after following 26 years of service, I felt like I needed to do my part to make a difference. I only had 205 days as a candidate, and Mr. Barber had just won the special election. And so I went to bed election night ahead of him and went to freshman orientation, and 11 days later I lost by 0.84%. He didn't yet have much of a record, but now he does. And that's what is different. And I don't think it's bipartisan when you say you voted against your party only 20% of the time. I mean, if that's what's going on in our country, that's what's wrong with Washington, D.C. We've had plenty of opportunities to see how Mr. Barber, when push comes to shove, will line up with Nancy Pelosi, whether it's voting against a border bill or voting against some bipartisan legislation that was going to help simplify the tax codes for students and parents that were trying to get access to higher education. So we've now got a record, and people are in a worse situation than they were before. So there's a lot that's happened, and people are looking for a fresh face. I've shown independent leadership. I've shown that I'm willing to make tough decisions and do what's right regardless of the cost.
Ms. McSally, you're out of time.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
The next question comes to you. Voter registration in this district is split nearly evenly, 30% each, between Republicans, Democrats, and no party or independent voters. Political strategists say to win this district with that voter makeup, it means you need to be at the center of the issue. First of all, do you agree? And how does that affect your stand on the issues relative to the respective parties that you both represent? And Ms. McSally, you have a minute.
Well, this is a very diverse district, and that's what makes us great. There's things that are dividing, certainly, some members of the community on certain issues, but there's things that we can agree upon that unite us. And again, having served in uniform, we're always looking for those solutions. And what we can agree upon now is people are looking for economic opportunity and national security. I mean, those things are just the two most fundamental issues that people are concerned about right now. And they want someone who's actually going to fight to bring good jobs here, that's going to provide the leadership we need in order to keep our country safe against the threats that we're facing right now. So I always am going to be solution-oriented and independent-minded and look for the things that unite us instead of the things that divide us. That's what people in the country are looking for, and we represent the diversity in our community. And I look forward to be able to serve everybody if I get elected, not just my party, but everybody in our community.
Mr. Barber, same question. Do you agree that you need to be a centrist to get elected in this district? And how does that affect how you stand on the issues with respect to where your party stands on issues?
I absolutely agree with that, Chris. Every time I talk to voters, they just say, can't you guys get something done? And the only way to get something done in Congress is to find common ground. That's why I'm a member of the Bipartisan Working Group. We meet every other week. We try to find common ground. We introduce bills that are bipartisan, and there have been a number of those. But I'd like to just say for a moment a little bit about what my opponent just said about her ability to go away from her party. If you look at what she represents, she wants to privatize Social Security. She wants to turn Medicare into a voucher system. She wants to destroy our education system by taking away federal government's involvement. She wants to make sure that women don't have the right to make their own health care decisions. That is party line with her party. I'd like to know which of those issues she's going to disagree with the party on. I have disagreed with my party whenever it was right for the voters of Southern Arizona, and that's what I'll continue to do. There is no way you should go to Congress and represent a party. You should go and represent the people who sent you there, and that's been my privilege and my honor, and I will continue to do that if I go back next January.
Christopher, can I respond to that?
Well, let's stay on this topic for a moment. Mr. Barber, you both have said in this that you want to see bipartisanship in Congress. Give a specific example, if you will, of what you would compromise in a piece of your party's legislation on an issue that would allow bipartisanship on a difficult piece of legislation. Mr. Barber, you have a minute for that.
Well, that's already happened. My record is clear that I've diverged from the party on many issues. For example, on the Affordable Care Act, there are a lot of benefits in the Affordable Care Act, but there are a lot of things about it that need fixing. The party that's representing, that my opponent represents, wants to repeal it, throw out the baby with the bathwater. And the people on the other side, the far end, say it's perfect. Well, it's neither. So I have voted for amendment after amendment after amendment to fix the parts of the Affordable Care Act that don't work. And I will do it again when we have an opportunity to go back in January. It's also the case with bipartisanship in terms of immigration reform and border security. McCain and Kyle and Flake in this state, the senators for this state, have brought a bill forward from the Senate that is bipartisan, that would fix the border security issue and also take care of the broken immigration system. My opponent says she wouldn't support it. A bipartisan bill that passed the Senate, her leadership would not bring it to the floor. There's big differences between us. I will always search for common ground. That's what I've done, and that's what I'll continue to do.
Ms. McSally, a specific piece of legislation that you could work a compromise on, maybe vote against your party, and also would you vote against your party more than 20% of the time as the benchmark you set on Mr. Barber's voting
Absolutely,
record?
Christopher. I mean, one great example is equal pay for equal work. You know, as a woman who has broken through glass ceilings and has dealt with all the challenges of being in leadership positions, I understand the challenges that women in leadership face. And so I will work to fight for women so that they get access to equal pay for equal work. But I can't let the attacks sit where they are. Those are all just misleading and lies. I have never said I want to privatize Social Security or voucherize Medicare. I mean, we only have one person in this election and in this campaign who has voted repeatedly to rob Medicare to pay for Obamacare, and that's our current congressman. And so when he can't talk on his record, he spends his time trying to attack me, who's a private citizen just trying to stand up and serve. Our seniors are struggling right now, and so he's using fear tactics to go on the attack, to distort my positions in order to save his job. And that's not what we need right now, and that's what's wrong with Washington.
We're going to return to a couple of these topics as we go through the evening, but let me ask you, Ms. McSally, you've accused Mr. Barber in the past and alluded to it tonight, a lack of leadership on his part. And you say that's a quality that you would bring to Congress. Let's be blunt. How does a freshman with no seniority take a leadership role? And any examples of someone who has done so?
Sure, absolutely. I served as a legislative fellow for Senator John Kyle when he was in his first term in the Senate. And I saw his example where he actually had credibility. He was a workhorse instead of a show horse. He had bipartisan respect, and he figured out how to get things done in order to fight for us. I saw that firsthand. Look, Mr. Barber has not been leading on many issues. If you look at how he talks, it's as if he's not in Congress. Congress must do this, and Congress must do that. I don't know if you get the memo. You're actually in Congress, Mr. Barber.
I know that.
And Congress is failing. I think the approval rating is down to, what, family relationships and paid staff. And it's time for us to change. And so we've got to bring someone who's actually going to lead. Look, it's, you know, 1 of 435. But I have shown, and I've gotten legislation passed myself as a private citizen related to the rules that they were making our servicewomen wear the burqa over in Saudi Arabia. And I worked hard in order to get that legislation passed. I wrote it, I got sponsors, and I personally shepherded that thing to be unanimously passed across the finish line. That's the kind of leadership I'll show.
Mr. Barber, follow up on this. How do you defend your record against the criticism from Ms. McSally?
Well, first of all, my opponent just said at the beginning of her remarks that it's all misunderstood, or it's a lie about her position on Medicare, Social Security. We need to just go back to 2012 when she took positions to say we should privatize Social Security by having people invest in the stock market. That is privatization. When she supported the Paul Ryan budget, that budget would have voucherized Medicare, changed the system forever. She also supported that budget which would have slashed Pell Grants in our state. 23,000 Arizona students would not have gotten a Pell Grant under the bill that she said she would have voted for. It also raised taxes on middle-class families to give big tax breaks to the wealthiest people in America. That's her position from 2012. And now, as we get close to the election, she's wanting to be a moderate, an independent. You can't have it both ways. She needs to be able to stand up and be truthful with the voters of Southern Arizona. Then I think we'll have a much better competition here, because that kind of slipping and sliding is easily seen. You cannot fool the voters. And as far as I'm concerned, I have been co-sponsoring bills and advancing bills that are independent, that are bipartisan. The 810 victory, for example, in terms of leadership, was one I hope we'll come back to, because that was an example of leadership in the Congress that I took.
Mr. Barber, your website says job growth is your top priority, and you say one solution is eliminating regulations. Give a specific example of eliminating a regulation that you have sponsored, or one that you will be sponsoring if elected to the 114th Congress, and how many jobs it would create.
Well, the regulatory issue is across many committees, but the one that's most in focus here is my membership on the Small Business Committee. As a former small business owner with my wife for 22 years, we know what it's like to be small business owners. We know what it's like to keep the doors open, to make a profit, to keep the customers coming back. You're not successful in business for 22 years if you don't know how to make it work. But one of the things that we experience is what I'm working on in Congress, and that is overregulation by the federal government of small businesses, and the absolute impossibility of getting access to capital. I'm on the subcommittee in the Small Business Committee that deals with access to capital, international trade. And I have voted for a legislation in that committee that would change the regulations, reduce the regulations on small businesses, and by doing so would allow small businesses to grow. Because 70% of our economy is based on small businesses. We have to cut them loose. We have to give them access to capital. And that's how we're going to grow our economy again and bring jobs back to Arizona and across the country.
Ms. McSally, obviously you can't talk about things you've voted on, but
Right.
if you're elected, what's a specific piece of legislation you would sponsor in the next Congress for a reduction of regulations?
So, Chris, since we don't get the opportunity for rebuttal, I have to go back. Just because you say something over and over again, Ron, doesn't make it true. I have never supported the things that he's talking about. I have stood up against my party on the Paul Ryan budget. And I'm going to fight to make sure we have a budget that is not balanced on the backs of veterans like my opponent actually voted for. So I held a small business roundtable this last week because the National Federation of Independent Business, who represents small businesses, came out here to endorse me instead of Congressman Barber. Because like many politicians, he talks a good game about supporting small business, but he doesn't actually get things done and help get the government off their backs. They talked about many different regulations, but in particular, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is hurting them. I had one small business owner who said that they used to have 15 employees and now they're down to 5. And they've used to provide health care coverage, but now they can't anymore because the premiums continue to go up. Some have stopped hiring people because they don't want to get over the 50-person limit. This is hurting our economy, and we need somebody who's actually going to fight to help small businesses grow, because that's where the most jobs come from.
Mr. Barber, let me come back to you for a second on something you said. Is it okay for a politician, be it an elected official or someone running for office, to change their mind over a 2-year period, or once you say something, that's it, you're stuck with it?
It's perfectly okay to say, I've changed my mind because I've learned more, I know more information, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is a total denial by my opponent that she ever said the things that she said. She said in an interview in 2012, as she was running for Congress, that she would support and vote for it. The words were, vote for the Paul Ryan budget. Let's not forget what that budget would do. It would turn Medicare into a voucher. It would make sure that the wealthiest people got a tax break at the expense of middle-class families. It would cut dramatically the Pell Grants. That's what she said. And she can say all she wants that she didn't say it. It's perfectly okay. I would be thrilled if she said, oh, I've learned more and I've changed my mind. But that's not what's being said here tonight. What's being said is I'm misrepresenting her position. I think the voters are much smarter than that. They know something's going on when somebody who has a dramatically different position one year says, I never said those things, I'm now in this place. The voters won't be fooled. I don't believe they'll ignore what she said in 2012. Her true positions are those positions, not the ones we're hearing tonight.
Ms. McSally, let me just ask you,
Absolutely.
2012 Ryan budget, at the time, did you say you supported that in 2012?
So I am repeatedly on the record saying I don't support the Ryan budget. I was asked a question that's being taken out of context when I was a brand new candidate. Of these three bad budgets, of the three, which one would you have voted for? The Democrat budget, the progressive budget, or the Ryan budget? And I answered, well, I guess I would have voted for that one, but here's the problems I have with it. And we have our current member of Congress who this last year had 5 budget proposals come up, and he voted against all 5 of them. So I was choosing from 3 very bad choices, and I have been repeatedly on the record saying that I have problems with the Ryan budget and that I would actually help form the next budget when we get to Congress that would address these things. I support Pell Grants. I don't support raising taxes on the middle class. I'm in the middle class. I have 3 federally funded degrees, 1 bachelor's at the Air Force Academy and 2 master's degrees. Of course I support higher education. I am a problem solver who's just trying to figure out how to get things done. I've learned a lot along the way. I'm thoughtful, and I'm going to read bills before I say I'm going to vote for them and not just give you sound bites for answers.
Since we started this particular line talking about Mr. Barber's website, Ms. McSally, let's talk about your website for
Sure.
a moment. Your website puts balancing the budget atop your issues
Right.
list. You say going line by line through the budget can eliminate waste and duplication.
Right.
Can you give a specific example and how much it would save?
Sure. We just had a report recently that said there was $35 billion of missed payments in Medicare, as one example. So we have got to make sure that we are good stewards of our taxpayers' money and that we're not having waste and fraud in programs like that. We've got 47 different job training programs, and we still are struggling to grow the economy. So look, we've got a federal government that's not working for us. If you look at one agency after the other, whether it's the VA, or the IRS, or many others, that the federal government is failing us. And so we have got to provide that oversight. And Congress is not doing its job just annually by making sure they provide that oversight by doing a budget and 12 appropriations bills. So we've got to go line by line. We've got to address the issues that are not a good use of the taxpayers' money and give it back to the taxpayers and help get our budget house in order.
Mr. Barber, the same question to you. Is there something specific in the budget that you would like to see pulled out to save money, and how much could you save?
Well, let me preface this by saying that the approach that the Congress took in 2011 to reduce the deficit was the wrong approach. It's called sequestration. It meant a 10% across-the-board cut on every federal program. It hurt our military, it hurt our veterans, it hurt research and development, it hurt all kinds of programs, including education. And I'm not in favor of sequestration. I've said that from the beginning, and I hope we can get rid of it. What I am in favor of, however, is taking an annual GAO study that actually has pointed out $90 billion in programs that could be reduced, eliminated, or somehow taken out of the budget. And that's the study that we ought to have. In fact, I've sponsored a bill that came out of our bipartisan working group that would do just exactly that. Every year when that report comes out, everyone says, oh, it's terrible, the budget's out of control, but they never do anything with the GAO report. Our bill would require every committee of jurisdiction to give an up or down vote on those budget reduction items. That's a big way to start, and that's what I would do.
This next question comes from one of our viewers or listeners tonight via Twitter using the hashtag CD2 questions. And they say both candidates' TV advertising is full of claims about the other. At the end of those ads, the candidates say they approve this message. How can voters trust anything either of you say in these ads? Mr. Barber, you have the first shot at this one.
I think the way for voters to really understand the truth about ads is a couple of things. First of all, you need to really dig in and find out what was said or done by the candidate as opposed to what they say in an ad. I believe that everything we have said in the ads that we've sponsored about my opponent have been factually based. In fact, we do a fact check before we put it out, and there's numerous citations that support what we say. So we're not going to put out misinformation. Unfortunately, my opponent is given to false information. She put out an ad, for example, just this week, that accused me of not being at a hearing on ISIS when I was present. That's the kind of false and misleading information that people need to know about. So it's important for us to know what a candidate really stands for and not to accept just what they say. And what they stand for is goes back to the roots of what they said, particularly in my opponent's case in 2012, when she was running vigorously to the right to make sure she got her party's nomination. And now she wants to convince us that she's moderate. I don't buy it, and I don't think the voters will either.
Ms. McSally, how can people believe what they see in the ads?
Well, I would say that I think this is what's wrong with Washington. We have an incumbent sitting congressman who is spending most of his campaign, him and his allies, and most of this debate so far, instead of talking about his record, actually attacking me with misleading facts, with misleading and untruthful attacks. Look, everything they're doing is trying to instill fear in the voters, scare the seniors, scare the middle class, scare women, and trying to move people to keep his job based on an emotion of fear. That's what's wrong with politics these days. I'm running my ads talking about what I bring to the table as someone who's a veteran, who's flown in combat, who's deployed 6 times to combat zones, who has shown leadership even when things are difficult to get done. And I'm offering an option in order to hire somebody new, because Washington's broken and Ron Barber is a part of the problem. We can change Washington by changing who we send to Washington. And so I'd ask that you would look at the ads of our current congressman and his allies that are based on misleading, lies, and fear instead of his own record.
Let's go and touch on something that you just touched on briefly, Ms. McSally, and Mr. Barber, you've mentioned also the A-10. You both have talked about the fight to keep the funding for the A-10. Considering that Davis-Monthan Air Force Base is one of the biggest economic drivers in our community, is this an economics and jobs issue, or is it a national defense issue? And Ms. McSally, you get to answer this one first for 1 minute.
Well, it's both, and I want to make sure that the voters know the A-10 is only funded for 65 more days until December 11th. I warned the community when I heard the A-10 was going to be cut last year in an editorial in the paper, and Ron Barber, our current congressman, is on the record the 1st of September last year saying there's flatly no threat to the A-10. Since then, he's been doing a lot of activity, but he has not been able to find the funding. Please do your research. Right now, the A-10 is only funded for 65 more days. I commanded the only A-10 squadron that's an operational squadron at Davis-Monthan in combat. I have 325 combat hours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know firsthand the national security treasure that this is when men and women are on the ground under fire needing close air support. It is an important economic driver in our community, $1.6 billion, and we've got so many jobs that count on it. But we need someone in D.C. who's going to make the argument that it's a national security treasure, and I know this firsthand. I don't need staff to rely on to be able to have that credibility.
Mr. Barber, same question, but let me put one little follow-up on there. Did you say that? What Ms. McSally is accusing you of saying about the A-10 being safe?
The question that was posed to me was, is there a long-term life for DM and the A-10? And my answer was, yes. In fact, does DM and the A-10 not going to be around for a while? I said, no, they're going to be around. And the reason why is that Davis-Monthan Air Force Base has been serving this community as a military installation for decades. We have the best flying weather of any place in the country. We have access to the Goldwater Range for live munition training. We have a relationship with Fort Huachuca. I grew up on that base, so I know the value as an asset. But let me talk specifically now about the A-10. My opponent says it's only funded for another 65 days. That is accurate if you just assume that we're not going to open the government after December 11th. What she's talking about is a continuing resolution, something we shouldn't be doing. We should be passing budgets for a full year. When we go back in November, we are going to have to extend that, and we will. We have never gone home without supporting our military establishment. The A-10 is a vital national security asset and an economic driver for our community, and I will continue to fight as long as I'm here to make sure we never lose the A-10 for this community.
We have another question from one of our viewers. This one about energy policy. Will each candidate, what will each candidate do to shift energy policy towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels? And again, this came to us via Twitter using the hashtag CD2 questions. And Mr. Barber, you go first on this one.
That's a great question from someone who obviously knows the value of renewable energy, particularly in this part of the country. You know, Tucson, if you look at a map of solar energy capability, is dead set in the center of the most solar energy available anywhere in the country, and we have capitalized on that. When I worked for Congresswoman Giffords, that was a main issue that we promoted and she promoted. And since she left office, I've continued that practice. We hold Solar 101 so people in the community can know more about solar and get it on their roof. I have solar on my roof. And we have created a lot of jobs in Arizona, 10,000 solar jobs since the effort started a few years ago. We have to have a renewable energy policy, but we also have to have an all-of-the-above policy because we need energy independence. And right now, we can't move away from some of the energy sources that we have and rely totally on solar or any other renewable energy. We have to have a bridge. And that bridge, I believe, is being built with solar energy, wind, and geothermal. We will get there. It's going to take a while. In the meantime, we have to have other sources as well.
Ms. McSally, same question to you regarding renewable energy and fossil fuels.
Well, unlike President Obama, I actually do believe in a true all-of-the-above energy policy. So that includes absolutely capitalizing and continuing to develop renewable energies, but it also means us getting access to the energy we have here that's recently been discovered in North America. We could be on our way to energy independence. I support building the Keystone Pipeline. I support getting access to the oil and the gas reserves that we have in a way that brings good stewardship. And I do not support the new EPA rules, which would tell Arizona to reduce our carbon emissions by 52%. That was going to shut down some of our power plants here in southern Arizona if we go in that direction. This is going to raise costs. We're going to lose jobs, and that is an absolute reckless rule by a federal agency that's not being had oversight provided to them by Congress right now. So we need a real all-of-the-above strategy that taps into the resources that we have, allows us to be independent, not relying on the Middle East, and also continues to develop these renewable energies.
For those of you just tuning in, this is a candidates forum for the candidates in Arizona's Congressional District 2. We're going to stay with a viewer question here that came to us via Twitter about the situation with ISIS in the Middle East. Do you support President Obama's strategy for combating ISIS? Ms. McSally, you have 1 minute.
President Obama has absolutely failed, and Democrats, Independents, and Republicans can agree. We watched this threat grow when we walked away from Iraq after all the blood and treasure my fellow men and women in uniform spent there. We've watched Syria just deteriorate into a failed state, and Obama's leadership from behind is an oxymoron for those of us in the military. He has failed to see this threat coming. It is now a threat that is more dangerous than Al-Qaeda after 9/11. I've got 2 master's degrees in national security, and I led targeting operations for the continent of Africa in my last job as a colonel. I understand the threat to terrorism, and we need to be using all elements of national power to deal with it. He is late to the game when this threat is very serious. And just the military that he's used has been late, and it's been not enough. We also need to use our diplomatic, economic, informational, and cyber instruments of power. But right now, he's not being taken seriously around the world. The best thing that we can do is elect someone to Congress with a background in national security to provide oversight, and that's what I bring, because Mr. Barber has no background in this.
So let me just be clear, you do not agree with the President's current strategy as it is being executed.
He has been late to the game, and it is not enough.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Barber, same question to you. Do you agree with the President's strategy on ISIS?
Well, as a member of the House Armed Services Committee, being on that committee now since I joined the Congress in June of 2012, I've had the opportunity to meet with the various chiefs of staff of the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, Marines, and I know that they have serious concerns about how we should proceed. Before we left Congress to come home for this election season, if you will, we voted, and I was one of the people who voted for it, a bill that would ensure that we take the fight to ISIS. This is a new word or a new name for evil. What ISIS has done, the capabilities they've accumulated with land and money and command structure and a 30,000 combat seasoned army, they are to be taken very seriously. And for me, it's taking the fight to them. And we have done it through the air, through drones, and through Tomahawk missiles that are manufactured here in Tucson at Raytheon. We need to do everything we can to dismantle and destroy this evil force in the world, and we need to make sure we protect the homeland from any incursions that they might bring to us by the people who went there from here and come back to do us harm.
So you agree or disagree with the president's current strategy?
Well, I think the president was late to the table on this, quite frankly. I think we saw this building, and his director of national intelligence, in fact, just the other day, said we didn't see it coming. We should have seen it coming. And that's why we have to have vigilance. That's why the House Armed Services Committee has held serious hearings questioning how we got to this point. But absolutely, we have to support what we're doing today. The Commander-in-Chief came to us and asked for our support. And when we are at war, as we are with ISIS, the Congress should come together, as it did in a bipartisan way, to support the Commander-in-Chief. Is it enough? I think time will tell. I'm concerned about the progress that ISIS is making, even in spite of our bombing. We need to continue to monitor this, and we have the President and his Department of Defense on a short leash saying, you got to come back to us and tell us your progress before we do anything else.
Ms. McSally, let's stay on ISIS for a moment. So you disagree with the President's strategy. Do we need boots on the ground, or is there a different way?
Look, I think this is just a false discussion about boots on the ground versus boots in the air. We have boots on the ground right now. I mean, we have our troops there. They're providing logistics. They're providing advisory roles. And we have got to be able to do what it takes in order to address this threat. So I think this is really a false argument. And our president talking about what he's not going to do is never smart when you're talking to the enemy. So, look, we've got the Kurds there, and they do have capable fighting force. We can provide air power to them. We likely need to embed some joint terminal attack controllers, JTACs, that we work with in the A-10 to make sure that they're identifying the targets, make sure we've got collateral damage assessments, and we're going after what's needed to be done. So we've got to address that in a way that allows them to take back their territory, but similar to what we did after 9/11, in the early days of Afghanistan, and I was part of that effort because I was overseas at the time. We dropped in special forces. They were embedded with the Northern Alliance, and they were able to call in airstrikes and let the indigenous forces actually address the issue. So I think this is just a false discussion about boots in the air and boots on the ground, and our Commander-in-Chief shouldn't be talking about that in front of our enemies.
Mr. Barber, do we want boots on the ground?
You'll have to work really hard to convince me that we should send our men and women back into combat in the Middle East. We have lost thousands of young Americans' lives. We've spent billions of dollars trying to help the people in Iraq and now in Afghanistan. I want to see our troops come home. And so I believe that what we have to do is continue the strategy that's in place and monitor progress very closely. And by that I mean the President and the Department of Defense need to, and are required to by the law we passed before we left, to report regularly on progress. But let me just say something else about the strategy which has not been discussed. It's a multi-level strategy. It's air attacks to try to dismantle the infrastructure, the command structure, and the weapons that the armor and so forth that ISIS has. It's trying to prevent them from making further progress in both Iraq and in Syria. But we have other factors that we need to attend to. We need to stop the flow of money to ISIS. They are making, by some accounts, $4 to $5 million a day by shipping oil through Turkey. We've got to stop it. We've got to disrupt that. We've got to make sure that we go on social media, as we are, to convince young Americans and Europeans they shouldn't go there.
Barber,
there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done, and we need to stay with the plan.
We are getting a lot of questions on social media about this next subject, and that's the border. Obviously, from where we are sitting right now, only about 70 miles away. How do you define a secure border? And please be specific, including some measurable outcomes to define what success is. And also, what's a timetable for meeting that definition that you have come up with? And Mr. Barber, again, you are first on this one and have 1 minute.
Well, I'm pleased to say that the Homeland Security Committee on which I sit has already moved in that direction to get measurements and to get progress and to secure the border. The people that I represent in Cochise County, between Douglas and the New Mexico state line, are at the mercy of the cartels every single day. It's got to stop. And we can do it by changing the border security strategy, getting the border patrols closer to the border, bringing assets closer to the border and not 5, 10, 20, 50 miles back. That's one thing that has to change. But the Border Security Results Act, which I co-sponsored, says to the Department of Homeland Security, you must, within a certain time, come back to us with specific strategies and measurements for progress. One of the problems is that everyone has a different definition of border security. We need to have a credible, universal definition. And the only way you can do that is by talking to the people who live on the border, who experience these issues every single day, and that's what my amendment to that bill did. It said you cannot have a strategy, you cannot have measurements without engaging the ranchers and others on the border.
So, Mr. Barber, what is a measurable success that you would like to see that would make the border defined as secure, something specific?
Yes, the bill that we've passed out unanimously out of the Homeland Security Committee says we need to get operational control of the border, we need 90% control of the border, and we need to make sure we have close to 100% in those high-risk areas. The district that I represent is a very high-risk area, and that's why we have to direct our attention to any place that we haven't essentially reduced the illegal immigration and the drug cartels coming through. 47% of the drugs seized on the southwest border are seized in the Tucson sector, which includes my district. That is totally unacceptable, and we need to fix it. And our bill moves us in that direction. One of the problems with the Department of Homeland Security is it has never come up with credible measurements. Our bill would force them to do so.
Ms. McSally, same question to you. Define a secure border, but give us some specifics, some measurable points to hit.
So in a debate 2 years ago with you, Mr. Barber said that he's been leading the effort to secure the border since 2006. And those ranchers that I talk to in Cochise County will tell you that he's failing at the job. And you may have seen those commercials. We have ranchers who previously supported Gabby Giffords and even supported Mr. Barber. And they're tired of the talk. They want something done. And so they're getting behind me. Our border's not secure, and this is a public safety issue. It's a national security issue. And those ranchers down there are making difficult life and death decisions sometimes to keep their families safe. So we've got to continue with the barriers and fences, but we need a different strategy. The Border Patrol is not at the border. They're in a defense in depth, and we need to use intelligence-driven operations with the assets that we have, technology and air assets, to monitor and intercept that activity with the manpower at the border. You know, for a specific measure, bureaucrats in D.C. always want to come up with a number. I mean, 90% secure. What does that mean? How do you know what the denominator is? You know, for those of us who've served in the military, we know you have to get an operational assessment by the commander of whether they've met the mission. So we need to rely on the local commanders and the local border residents and the ranchers, and that'll help us to measure that.
Ms. McSally, let's stay on border security for a moment. You both have called for better border security to stop human trafficking and drug smuggling and the violence that both of those issues bring. What your positions don't seem to address is the U.S. demand for drugs and cheap labor. So what would you do about that demand? And you have 1 minute.
So addressing the root cause of the issue for those that are coming over here, aside from the cartels, is that our legal immigration system and our visa system is totally broken. I mean, we have people in border communities like Douglas who want to be able to come over and work and then go back home at the end of the day or at the end of the season, and there's no easy way for them to do that. I met with a University of Arizona professor 2 nights ago who's been teaching in 25 years, giving out PhDs in a science and technology field, and he said there's only been 5 U.S. citizens who've gotten those PhDs. Everybody else is a foreigner. So we train them here at the U of A and we send them back to compete against us in other countries. So we need to have an immigration system and a visa system that welcomes those who want to work, that helps our economic growth on all ends of the spectrum related to skills and trade. And we do that, then we address some of the root causes of why we are in the situation that we are right now. We keep wanting to have Band-Aids instead of actually addressing these root causes, and so that's what leadership will do.
Mr. Barber, same question.
You're absolutely right that there is a demand, otherwise there wouldn't be the delivery of both drugs and people to come to work. With paid under the counter. The immigration bill, the Border Security and Immigration Bill that passed the Senate on a bipartisan vote that was sponsored by Senators McCain and Flake, is one I can support. I'd like to see a different aspect on the border security piece. The Border Security Results Act that we passed out of our committee would be, I think, a better fit. But I would take that bill and run it to the floor of the House. The problem is that the leadership of the party that handpicked my opponent doesn't even want to bring it to the floor so it can be discussed. I believe we need a temporary worker program so that people can come here safely and legally and go home. I believe we need a DREAM Act so that young people who came here through no fault of their own can go to college or in the military. My opponent says absolutely not to that. We need to bring 11 million people out of the shadows so they can be paid legally above the ground and make sure we go through a significant background check to vet them before they go to any kind of legal status. That will make our budget better because people will be paying taxes. So that's what I support. My opponent, on the other hand, Chris, has called the McCain-Flake bill the Obamacare of immigration. That is mocking our two senior senators.
Mr. Barber, what about the demand? What do we do to cut the demand for the cheap labor and the drugs?
Well, I think you've got to crack down on employers, because employers who hire illegally are breaking the law, just like the people who go to work for them. And I believe that we need to have more enforcement, more ICE agents going after people who are breaking the law. And the McCain-Flake bill would do just that. Again, my opponent says she won't support it, but I think it's a good path forward if only her leadership that picked her would bring it to the floor of the House. I believe it would pass with a strong bipartisan vote.
Ms. McSally, let me come to you and change topics again. We're
Sure.
going to go to Medicare now. Big piece of the budget. We talked earlier about the Ryan budget and what it would do regarding Medicare. That was your position, as we talked about, has been reported in 2012. But let's talk about it now, as you clarified earlier. How do you reduce Medicare spending?
So let me just first go back to the border, because he's gone over his time multiple times. But there was a bipartisan bill that came up to the House right before they went on recess related to the border. And so when push comes to shove, Mr. Barber talks a good game about the border, but when Nancy Pelosi tells him to line up, he said, "Yes, ma'am," and he voted against it. And this is what's wrong with Washington, D.C. People who say one thing while they're here, but they vote for something else when their party tells them to line up. Now, when coming to Medicare, I've never supported Medicare voucher system. And I've also never supported robbing Medicare by $716 billion in order to pay for Obamacare. In this debate 2 years ago, you remember, when I called Mr. Barber on this, he doubled down on it and said, those aren't cuts to Medicare, those are overpayments to providers, supporting them wholeheartedly. He now knows he has a problem with seniors, and that's why he's on the attack. I support initiatives that bring the cost of health care down so that Medicare and health care is affordable for us and our country and our seniors. And I will do that when I get to Congress.
Mr. Barber, let me come to you on this. She just said you are going to cut Medicare. You doubled down on it. Can you defend that? And how do you reduce Medicare spending, yet keeping the system sustainable?
Well, the falsehood that my opponent just put out one more time, as she's been putting it out since she ran her ads from the beginning of this race, has to be dealt with. Independent fact-check organizations have looked at that charge and found it absolutely false, and yet she continues to repeat it over and over again. What she did support, though, was a $716 billion cut to Medicare benefits that was in the Paul Ryan budget she would vote for. She can't have it both ways. But as far as what we need to do to reduce Medicare costs, we do need to deal with fraud and abuse. We have millions of dollars, billions of dollars going out the door every single day because providers are billing fraudulently. We have to crack down on them, as we did in Florida not too long ago, where we brought several indictments against providers who were billing $500 million in that case fraudulently. So that's one way to do it. But we also need to make sure that we bend the curve of healthcare costs. And that's what I believe is going on right now. If you look at the data, clearly healthcare costs are coming down. That's where we need to go, because they will ruin this country if we don't break the curve and bring it down.
Let's stay on healthcare, but a little different topic within healthcare. A key issue in healthcare is veterans and the shortage of resources, including physicians, for veterans. Because Congress supplies resources by way of appropriation, are these issues that are your responsibility, and what would you do to make sure that the VA medical system has more resources? Mr. Barber, you get to answer this one first.
Well, we have actually taken action on that, I'm pleased to say, and now we need to monitor the implementation of the Veterans Reform Act that was passed, not unanimously, close to unanimously by the House, and was a conference bill from the Senate. We have done that. We've given it to the President. He signed it. We have a new Secretary of VA, a guy with a lot of experience in managing large organizations. We need to change the culture of the VA to make it more receptive and responsive to our veterans. Look, my father was a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. If he were alive today, he would be as outraged as anybody, and I certainly am too, that what we discovered in the Phoenix VA system, which was absolute corruption, where people who should have been serving our veterans actually were hiding them on a paper waiting list so they could get bonuses. We've dealt with that in the bill that we talked about. We've also given $10 billion to the VA system to contract outside of the system so that veterans who live in rural areas that I represent will be able to get access to medical care and behavioral health care in their communities. That's what we're doing. It's not just talk, it's action.
Ms. McSally, same question to you regarding veterans health care. What can we do?
So for those who raise their right hand to serve, like I did, and 85,000 others in our community, we have a covenant with them that they're going to put their lives on the line to protect us, and we're going to make sure we take care of them. And what has happened at the VA is absolute dereliction of duty at the national level. Now, like many people, I get my care from the Southern Arizona VA health system, and when you get in there, you get great care from the providers there. But it's cumbersome and challenging, and the system is one that is allowing senior executives to be benefiting while veterans are struggling. Mr. Barber was serving in Congress for 3 years while this was happening on his watch, and he was at a speech on Memorial Day saying he's known there's been systemic problems at the VA for 6 years. Bystanders are ones people who complain about problems and know about them, but leaders are people who actually get things done. So we've got to make sure we have more veterans in Congress to fight for our veterans. We've got less than 20%. And so I'm going to go to Congress and I'm going to make sure that the veterans get the care that we promised and the care they deserve.
Ms. McSally, let's stay with you. Again, changing topics as we begin to wind this up. You were recently endorsed by the NRA, received an A rating from them. What, if any, limit should there be on gun ownership?
Look, there's no secret, Christopher, that I'm a Second Amendment supporter. I've shot the 30 millimeter in combat. And we can all agree that we want to minimize and we want to make sure that gun violence obviously is addressed in our communities. And we have different ways of talking about that. But the way that this has happened in this campaign has just been disgraceful. There were ads that were run by your allies that were considered vile and nasty by the Arizona Republic. And we repeatedly asked for you to stand up against them. And Mr. Barber, you wouldn't do it. Day after day, you wouldn't do it. They finally took the ad down because it was so horrendous. And you have an opportunity now tonight to denounce that ad and apologize. Do you believe that that ad was wrong, Ron?
When my time is up, I'll talk. When my time comes, I'll respond.
No, please respond now.
When my time is
I will
up.
give you my time.
Mr. Barber, since we have 3 seconds left on the clock, let me turn the question to you. What do you think of that ad?
Well, first
and
of
where
all,
do you stand on ownership of guns and limits and things like that?
I really want to be really clear with this question because it's very important to me as a survivor of a mass shooting, as someone who believes in the Second Amendment, supports it. And what happened to you, Martha, what you said happened to you was horrific. It should happen to no woman. I've got 2 daughters. I've got 3 granddaughters.
So
I want to make sure.
Wrong.
Let me finish. Okay. I want to make sure that they're protected. I want to make sure that you're protected. Every woman is protected. That ad was not run by me, and I'm not going to talk about an ad that I didn't sponsor. But when you talk about allies, the ad was run by someone who is highly regarded in this community and across the country for her work to prevent gun violence, and that's Gabby Giffords. But that aside, what my opponent has said is that she now accepts the notion that we should have misdemeanor stalkers prohibited from having a gun. The problem with her position is that she still refuses to say we should expand background checks. 40% of the guns purchased in this country are purchased outside of the background check system. My opponent says she wouldn't expand it. I believe we must.
Mr. Barber, thank you. We're wrapping this up here. If Congress continues to be unable to act or unwilling to act, especially on things like immigration, should President Obama use his executive power? And you have 1 minute for this, Mr. Barber.
I believe that there's been way too much use, not just by this president, but by presidents going back decades. Way too much accumulation of authority and power, taking it away, and honestly, Congress allowing it to happen, that we've chipped away at the check and balance system that this country was founded on. Congress has an absolute responsibility to respond to the immigration crisis in our country, the border security crisis. Every crisis that we face, Congress has to have their hands on it and be active involved with it. I do not believe the president should act alone. He should come to Congress, and Congress should step up to its responsibilities. John Boehner needs to bring the McCain-Flake bill to the floor so we can vote on it. It would pass in a heartbeat if we brought it to the floor. That's how it should be done, in what we call regular order, where the Congress has its hands on any important issue like this and the decisions that have to be made.
Ms. McSally, same question about presidential executive order usage.
People are very frustrated with what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. It is so dysfunctional, and the president and both parties are to blame. I totally disagree with the president moving forward on executive order and things that are clearly Congress's responsibility. Look, Congress is failing to address these issues, and the president is failing to lead. But you're in Congress, Ron, and you've been there for almost 3 years. And people are very frustrated with the dysfunction going on there. Leaders are people that are going to actually go there and make things happen. Instead of sitting back and complaining what the leadership's going to do, actually influence what the leadership's going to do. Make things happen, get things done, do the right thing, and serve the people of Southern Arizona as a servant leader. That's what we need right now. Everybody, all 435 get to be decided whether they should be hired and fired again. We need to send people to Congress that are actually going to get things done.
Thank you so much. And we have reached the end of time for our questions. We now go to closing statements, which are 90 seconds. Ms. McSally, you have the first closing statement and 90 seconds.
Thank you. Well, Washington is broken. We can all agree on that. And we change Washington by changing who we send to Washington. And I would ask those who are viewing tonight to tune out the slick, lying attack ads and take a fresh look at your options here. I'm asking you to take a fresh look at me, my background, my experience, and what I've done to make a difference. And take a hard look at Mr. Barber's record. Are you better off than you were 3 years ago? For most people, the answer is no. It's time for a change. We talked about issues tonight, but character matters. And even those groups or outside groups, all you needed to do was say, I thought they were wrong. But silence is consent. The biggest question I get on the campaign trail is not just about issues, but they say, you know, you sound like you want to get things done, but how do I know you're not going to go to D.C. and become like the rest of them and actually buckle to the pressure? And a lot of candidates say, well, I promise I won't do that. But I've shown that with my life. When I was deployed on my first of 6 combat tours to the Middle East, and 5 to the Middle East and 1 to Afghanistan, I walked by the duty desk and I saw the photo of a young enlisted woman wearing Muslim garb. And I said, I don't walk by a problem. I started to ask questions to try and figure out how to change this. For 6 years, I fought on behalf of them. They then ordered me over to Saudi myself, told me to sit in the backseat of the car, put the burqa on, and they were going to take me up on charges. I fought for 13 months to get it changed one last time, and on my way out of that,
Ms. McSally, thank you so much. We're out of time.
I filed litigation and I got a law passed.
Mr. Barber, you now have 90 seconds for your close.
Well, again, thank you, Chris, and Arizona Public Media for having us here tonight. I think tonight's debate has been very informative to the people of Southern Arizona. You know, I went to Congress in 2012, and I said I would be an independent voice. I would reflect the values of Southern Arizona. I would take my almost lifelong residence here, and my wife's being born here, my children being here, my grandchildren here, and our family being here, the deep roots that we have, and I would take that understanding of this district to Congress and be your voice. And that's what I believe I've done over the last 2.5 years. And I'd be honored, deeply honored, to go back and do it again for another 2 years. The important thing here is trust. Do you know who the candidates are and what they really represent? I believe that people know who I am. I've lived here a long time. I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of different ways, as a public servant, as a businessman, as Gabby's district director, and now as a member of Congress. People know Ron Barber. And the mythology, the lies, the misrepresentations that my opponent throws out, including saying I wasn't present at a meeting, a hearing on ISIS when I was. You know, I have a document I'd like to share with my opponent before we leave tonight. It's the attendance sheet for the hearing in Homeland Security that she says I wasn't present. Clearly, I was. This is the kind of misinformation, misrepresentation that my opponent has engaged in. She's also tried to tell us she doesn't believe the things she believed in 2012. I think the voters are smarter than that.
Mr. Barber, I have to cut you off. We are out of time. Thank you, Ron Barber, Martha McSally, both of you for coming. And for those of you tuning in, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. That concludes our Your Vote 2014 Candidates Forum for the Arizona 2nd Congressional District. I'm Christopher Conover. Have a good evening.